Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Brown, and I wanted to discuss in my long oral presentation how different apps can influence our language choices. I want to start out by basically giving like an introduction to why I did this before going to the different course concepts of frames, code switching, and mediating information. Before I finish off with my interviews of my good friends Sean and Will, and giving a conclusion. First of all, I wanted to do this project because I've noticed that my styles of communication look very different across different apps that I'm using. I've noticed that on apps such as Snapchat, I will send images with text attached versus on Instagram, a lot of times I will simply just text someone like a message. And yeah, I wanted to kind of explore what causes this difference in communication on different apps. Um, I also wanted to explore why communication is communicated differently on different apps, such as like how news is transmitted on Instagram versus Facebook or another app. Yeah, let's just get into it. First of all, I wanted to talk about frames. I discussed frames in my last presentation, but frames basically act as a set of expectations or norms for any discourse within a context. They're very important. We first found out about them in the AGAR readings, speech acts, and coherence. And the way I like to think about them is think about the difference in frames between the lecture frame and the discussion frame. Like you would expect a professor to speak differently, sound differently, use different words than a TA teaching the same lesson. And yeah, you can translate you translate those concepts to like Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook. Like there's different frames and different contexts within those different apps, and thus you're going to be using different language based on those contexts. Something else that's important about frames is frames often lead to code switching. Code switching occurs when someone changes their dialect or language or their linguistic code in response to a change in their environment. And a lot of times that change in environment is the same as just a change in frame. Code switching is discussed a lot by De Leon in his paper about the youth in Mexico and how they change their linguistic codes depending on who they're around. He talked about how they're speaking a lot more in their traditional languages when they're around parents and grandparents and elders. But when they're around other youth, they're speaking in more mainstream languages today, like English or Spanish. And basically, the reason why they're doing this is because the different frames that exist within those different groups mean that they speak in different languages. And like what we did with frames, we can transmit those ideas of code switching into the different apps. Like on on Instagram, I know that I'm going to be using shorter and a lot more concise and a lot more slang languages than I would be using an iMessage. Like if I was an iMessage, I would be using a lot more formal of a tone, a lot longer and more complete sentences. The way I like to think about it is think about the difference between how are you doing today, sir, versus what's up, dude? How you doing today? And thirdly, I wanted to talk about how I want to step back for a second and think about how individuals communicating to other individuals is different from the information being communicated to them. Spitzelnick said in her article how media, when it transmits information, has a lot of power because that can help create like language communities. And something else I remember in lecture, we talked about how a lot of different things can be a form of media differently from just what we traditionally think of as media. Um, where basically media is just anything that information is transmitted over. And a lot of times apps can serve as like these social media apps can serve as a form of media. Like I know I personally have gotten a lot of news on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and other apps, but the way this news is transmitted is different across the different apps. Like on Instagram or TikTok, it's going to be a lot more to be a lot shorter, a lot more concise, a lot more eye-catchy, if you will, to grab people's attention more versus on other apps like Facebook, the articles are going to be a lot longer and a lot more easily shared versus on like Instagram where it's just like a link in the comment section versus on Facebook where it's just like the thing is made up of like the link and the information with it. And yeah, there's several different reasons for this. Like sometimes different social media teams could think that different groups are going to be using different apps, and thus they need to cater to those different groups and establish things within those frames. But there's also several different reasons why this occurs. And finally, I wanted to discuss the interviews I conducted with my good friends, Sean and Will. I conducted them last week. They had a lot to say about how the way they communicate on apps differs depending on the app, depending on the linguistic context of the app. Like they mentioned how they code switch a lot. And they also mentioned how they had thoughts about how messages were communicated to them on the apps. We'll start with my friend Sean. Sean acknowledged how he talks differently on different apps because he feels like they have different contexts. Like he feels like the frame in different apps is different. So he speaks differently, he'll code switch, he'll do many different things to fit within those frames. My other friend Will agreed with Sean heavily. He feels like apps can cater to specific audiences, but then he feels like apps can cater to different audiences. He feels like different people will use the apps and thus there needs to be different frames within the apps. But something I noticed was that they both mentioned how they feel like apps can cater to different groups. Like Will more specifically talked about it, but both of them mentioned how communication was being displayed to them in different ways, depending on how they feel like the makers of the app and the people using the app are able to spread that information. And that's something I found very interesting. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. And yeah, thank you.